My name is Pete Kazanjy. I'm the founder of a company called Atrium. Why you should listen to me with respect to sales and go-to-market. I don't have a background in sales, or at least I didn't have a background in sales. My background is actually in product marketing and product management. I worked at VMware, working on the infrastructure team and then the desktop virtualization team before starting a recruiting software company called TalentBin as a business generalist founder. At which point I had to learn how to sell software, or else the company was going to die and go out of business. So it was a pretty good motivation to figure out how to do selling. So that was about 6 years ago or so. I went from our first sales rep to sales manager, VP of sales. Eventually the organization was bought by Monster Worldwide, not the headphone company or the power drink company, but the old dying recruiting job board. Where I led new product sales for 600 really old school sales reps. So that's kind of like my background in going from being a founder, like a founder, business generalist, technical enough to like talk at dinner parties about things, person to a go-to-market leader. And so since then, I run the nation's largest sales operations, sales leadership community called Modern Sales, a sister community called Modern SaaS. And I wrote a book on sales for founders called Founding Sales. It's essentially the book that I wish had already existed when I was doing a really bad job of figuring out how to do go-to-market myself. So that's why you should listen to me.
Dan Portillo, I'm a partner at Greylock. I've been there for 7 years. I work very closely with our early stage companies. A lot of early team building and hiring the first of like everything. So early engineers, early product managers, early salespeople. Started my career in '99 working for a number of startups, and then I joined Mozilla when it was 20 people. And part of the reason I loved my time there, and I was there for 5.5 years, was we generated a lot of money and had no salespeople. And so, like, my friends were all salespeople, but like I loved having a company that was like predominantly all engineers. And then moving to Greylock and working with our companies and helping them to build a business, like really learn the appreciation of go-to-market and what, like, how much like that really matters. Like, it's not just like a wonderful product, but actually having a team that's able to kind of sell it and acquire customers is incredibly important. And so to just start off, so Pete, so will just hiring salespeople completely destroy the culture of your company?
No. Running out of money and not being able to raise your next round will definitely destroy the culture of your company. So to the extent that you are able to hire and onboard people that will help you scale your organization and continue to grow the organization is a good thing. Now, doing that in a way that is good for your organization, like, that's a whole different topic. But a lot of founders have this misconception around go-to-market and salespeople in general that helps them, or that causes them to resist doing that, and that's definitely an anti-pattern. Like, and a lot of organizations like to beat their chest about the fact that they don't have salespeople, like Atlassian or GitHub or whatever. It's like total bullshit. If you go and like look on if you do LinkedIn queries in their organizations, they have tons of salespeople in those organizations. Palantir has tons of salespeople. They just call them business development, right? And so, like, having that antipathy to somebody who is specialized and focused on revenue acquisition is something that is bad for your organization. So that is an unequivocal truth with respect to SaaS companies.
So I've seen this a lot with our early stage companies that have incredibly technical founders. So there is a reluctance to like bring in like someone with a go-to-market background, and I've seen it repeatedly. A couple of companies kind of pay for it, in which it's taken them much longer to get a product in market because they were building for like taking in a lot of feedback and not necessarily understanding like what people are willing to pay for and where the value lies, and like the importance of getting to something to market earlier. And so when you're really strong technically, you tend to lead with that skill. And so sometimes like you have to learn how to step back from that. And so I remember when in the early days of building Atrium, like you were doing a lot of early kind of pre-customer work ahead of doing this, and I'm wondering if you could just share some of that.
Yeah, totally. We'll talk about two things. I can talk about some of the early customer development that we did at Atrium, and then also, actually, maybe what I'll talk about first is this customer interaction antipathy that you oftentimes see in organizations that think that you can just like publish API documents and like people will magically buy. I think that has anyone heard of David Skock? You guys, okay, so look him up. He's a partner at Matrix. He does a lot of really good writing on developer sales motions, specifically because he was an early investor in the company called JBoss. It's an early application app server that kind of like beat ass on WebLogic and Oracle back in the day. And the way that they were able to do that is not because people would just download the software and use it and give them money, but it created this massive inbound funnel of people who were downloading the open source software and using it. That was lead gen. That wasn't the business itself. That was lead gen for the eventual business that was an enterprise business of higher ASP. So the thing to realize is that it is highly unlikely that you are going to get to enterprise scale on $10 or $50 a month. Probably the only examples of that are, so I think that Dropbox's average order value right now is $100 or maybe $150 a month, or sorry, a year per customer as compared to Box. So the thing to think about when you're looking at that and saying like, oh, well, like Dropbox, they don't have a really big sales organization and like it just magically sold itself and what have you. File sharing is a really huge market. Like everybody needs file sharing. And so don't accidentally pattern match that and think that you're going to be able to get your business to that scale at like $150 per customer per year, because just the economics don't work. However, using that as a lead generation funnel, right? So like New Relic, for instance, they have a huge inbound lead generation funnel, which then is used to engender sales conversations. So that's one thing to think about with respect to like not thinking that you don't necessarily have to talk to customers because the product is going to be able to sell itself. Yes, it will. People will be able to download it themselves, but it's not necessarily you're not going to be able to sell it yourself. Or sorry, it's not going to be able to sell itself. The second thing you wanted me to touch on was the customer development stuff. Early on, some of the things you can do things early on that will set you up for success when you're actually scaling your go-to-market as you're doing your customer development part of your product development. So one of the things that we did, people are familiar with first round review. There's a really great article by a gentleman named Michael Sippy, who's a former VP of product from Twitter. It's called Get in the Van. I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in customer development. But it talks about doing customer interviews in a very structured fashion. So at Atrium, for instance, we did 150 plus customer interviews when we were first starting out that covered the entire matrix of our user base. So sales operations people, VPs of sales, VPs of customer success, VPs of engineering, et cetera. And we were talking to them about how they use data to instrument the performance of their teams. But in the process of doing that, in order to inform our product development, in addition to recording all the insights and like recording everything and getting it transcribed and what have you, we're also picking off people who were the most engaged and thoughtful. Because like very quickly in an interview, you can figure out whether or not it's like someone has their head up their ass and is like not interested in talking to you, or is actually really engaged in the problem and is thoughtful and what have you. And so those folks, you can grab them and kind of like put them in your pocket for later. And so the way to do, kind of the traditional way to do that is with a customer advisory board. And that's really helpful because in addition to them being engaged and stoked on your success, they're also folks who can be your early customers, your early enterprise customers. And so that's actually been something that's been very successful for us. It's something that is a little bit more hands-on than your traditional developer sales motion of like, okay, we're just gonna have like a shitload of inbound and we're gonna like, dig through all the chaff and try to figure out where the needles are in there. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive behaviors. Like you can have a big inbound funnel to figure out that allows you to see, okay, oh wow, looks like we're getting a lot of people from Microsoft or Lockheed. That's interesting. We had like no idea. Actually, Edith from LaunchDarkly and Dan and I were talking about this earlier, where she had an initial hypothesis that LaunchDarkly was going to be something that people would be able to slap down a credit card for, and then early on they started seeing that there were larger enterprise companies that were interested in talking to them, and so she got a piece of information from that. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Like the notion of a large inbound funnel as compared to intentional customer development and like customer advisory board go to market, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
So I see a lot of like early stage startups, like they're looking to build their early go to market team, and they're looking to hire reps out of kind of name brand companies like Salesforce. Like, why is that potentially a mistake?
So I think there's kind of two things to consider. And first, when you hire your first like sales professionals is really kind of contingent on how developed your organization's sales motion is. So if you're hiring salespeople with an expectation that they're going to figure out whether or not the product fits the market, that's a really bad approach. It's a total anti-pattern. So in a deck that I present pretty frequently, I call that like sprinkling some sales on it. Like, oh, I'm going to hire a sales bro or a sales broette in order to do initial go-to-market for me. That's a really great way of wasting a lot of time and energy. So that's the first thing. So like, don't hire sales before you've proven that you can exchange money for value, like that someone will give you money in exchange for using your software and they'll get value out of it at a statistically significant amount. What does statistically significant mean? It's different depending on the size of the transaction. So like, I'm not to pick on Edith, but we're homies. So in the case of LaunchDarkly, after Edith sold the first half dozen or dozen $50,000 contracts, at that point you could probably get a salesperson in there to then go and replicate that. So then once you do that and you say, great, now I want to take, one of the things I think is a helpful metaphor for go-to-market is actually software development. Insofar as early on, what you're doing is you're developing like the process by which you sell the solution. The term of art for that is a sales motion. The way to think about it is essentially just like the software, like the sales software that you're developing. And so early on, you're iterating in that, and you're iterating, and there's bugs in it. And then when you get it to the point where it executes on your local, then what you want to do is clone that off and shove it into other reps. And so then the thing that after you do that, or after you've gotten it to the point where it's ready to go to another salesperson, the profile of person that you're looking for is probably not like, it needs to be aligned with the software that you're selling. So a good example of this would be, we were talking about application performance monitoring earlier. So New Relic's ASP for like most of their existence up through their IPO was only around $5,000, $5,000 to $10,000, because they had this huge inbound funnel. Install the New Relic agent, get a funny T-shirt, right? And the data's flowing. Oh, okay. Do you actually want to see more insights from it? Great. Like, slap down your credit card, etc. As compared to AppDynamics, who also did application performance monitoring, but their ASPs were north of $100,000, et cetera, et cetera.
And their churn was drastically less.
Yeah, exactly. So similar products, but like different approaches. And so in the case of AppDynamics, because I think they started out primarily focused on Java. .NET. Okay. So they started out focused on .NET, which is like very enterprisey, right? You have a lot of organizations with developers, middle of the country, what have you, that need APM, but these are big ass organizations as opposed to sexy startups that are running on Ruby or Python or what have you, where like the size of the organization is much smaller and the average sales price is going to be much smaller. So if you have those two different sales motions, the person you want to hire for the AppD sales motion is not a very it's not a transactional person out of, I don't know, what would be a good example here, like Xamarin, right? Or something like very low ASP where there's a lot of like inbound or what have you. This is going to be like, I guess the AppDynamics people came out of Computing Associates. This is going to be an Oracle sales rep or a high-end database, like a person who is used to long sales cycles, relationship-based selling, et cetera, versus the New Relic salesperson is somebody who's more transactional, is used to managing 50, 100, et cetera, transactions, concurrent transactions at once. And so understanding, like the way to think about salespeople is not dissimilarly from thinking about engineers, where you would never expect to hire like a back-end engineer, back-end engineer who works in Java or what have you, to work on all of your sexy front-end features. It would be ridiculous, right? And you should think about it the same way when hiring salespeople, is you want them to have the skill profile that aligns with your sales motion.
The same thing is true for recruiters. So I've hired a lot of like early recruiters in companies and interviewed a lot of recruiters from Google and other places. And so usually when you have a product that everyone's already heard of, like it's very different when you're selling something that no one's ever heard of before. And so you need people that can really articulate value. And so there's a subset of people that help build a brand, and there's people that work within that brand. And I have a very good friend that worked with me at an early stage startup, and he was awful. Like he couldn't sell anything, and then went to Salesforce and is now like doing amazingly well there because there's collateral and lead gen, and there's a very well understood go-to-market motion, which if you don't have that, like it's a very different type of person that is comfortable kind of walking a tightrope without a net. And so being able to kind of understand that when you're trying to build a brand, like having someone that's coming from a brand is used to having all the tailwinds of being able to kind of
that's really good. There's the sales motion fit, which is what I was describing earlier, and then there's like the stage fit. A lot of times people mistake they think about a brand as being monolithic, like, oh wow, that's a New Relic salesperson, or that's an AppDynamics salesperson, or that's I'm trying to think of another dev tools company, but I work in sales ops and marketing ops, so I'm having a hard time. As opposed to saying, oh, when were they a salesperson there? Were they one of the first 10 or 20 salespeople there, or were they the 500th salesperson there?
And I think that the market's kind of changed quite a bit. So there used to be, like back in the day, there was a company called PTC, and PTC was known for having awesome salespeople. And so a lot of them went to Blade Logic, and Blade Logic had a really great sales team. But now like people change jobs so quickly that there's not as much of an investment in training as there used to be. And so there's not a lot of good places where like, oh, if someone worked there, they definitely are a good salesperson. So it takes a little bit more kind of digging. Like what are some things to look for in someone that might be like potentially outstanding?
So the most important thing to do there is to do job simulation. So the same way, it's actually fun, now that I'm thinking this through, it's not dissimilar from how you would, a lot of these answers are not dissimilar from engineering answers, where when you're doing engineering hiring, you're doing portfolio work, you're doing code tests, you're doing whiteboard coding, things like that, essentially just simulating the way that the job would work, although I suppose whiteboard coding is not exactly how your job would work. You do the same thing with salespeople, right? So like, yes, look at their portfolio as indicated by their historical performance, but also have them run through the actual processes themselves. So,
sell me this pen.
Not the pen, that's like terrible. It's more like, so one of the things that I always like to do with salespeople is have them sell me their solution. I don't really think it's fair to have them try to sell you your solution, or at least it's higher risk because them getting intimate with your solution is going to be a process over time, whereas they should be super intimate with their existing solution. And if you have your act together as a hirer or as an entrepreneur, you should at least be able to consume what's going, like their website and their marketing collateral, and in order to play a fairly reasonable customer. And so have them run you through a sales cycle, right?
I also throughout the years kind of look for people that drastically outperform their peer group. So if you get a sense of like within their peer group, like are they like 1x, 1.5 times better? Like I have a recruiter that I hired who used to work at Google. And so he was on the SRE recruiting team. So the quota for SRE was 2 a quarter. The average was 1, and he was doing 10 to 15. So he was like 10 to 15 times more productive than the average person on his team.
Wow.
And so, so looking for people that are productive, but like that's also not sufficient. So you need to understand the circumstances of that productivity. So like why were you so productive? Like, were you getting good leads? Like, was it one customer that drove like your revenue number? And so helping them like understand why they're that much more productive than others, like in the same cohort. But like my general pattern of looking for people that outperform people at their level or have a job a level above where they should for their years of experience has been a good indicator for me of figuring out like what to look for. So for given like the network, like the set of companies in the audience, like what do you think that like does sales ops play a different role in companies that are more developer oriented or that have like a user adoption model?
Yeah. So folks familiar with sales operations? So sales operations, I guess it's not dissimilar to DevOps insofar as it's the function that makes sales run more smoothly. So I like to think about it as the part of the organization that is the product management function for the sales org itself. So it focuses on removing friction, instrumenting or analytics and instrumenting the performance of the organization and what have you. So when you need somebody full-time focused on that, as opposed to the slice of the sales leader or founder that is focused on that, is oftentimes contingent on your go-to-market. So if your ASP's average selling price is super high and you have a long sales cycle and you're talking about, so like use MemSQL as an example. Really big ASPs selling into large IT organizations, and former Oracle sales reps that have $2 or $3 million quotas, and they retire it with 5 to 10 deals in a year. You don't really need a lot of CRM excellence in order to execute that, because they're only probably managing 20 or 30 deals concurrently. And so the level of like sales operations excellence that is required for something like that is probably lower than a company like Xamarin that had a massive fire hose, or like Snowflake. Actually, let's use Snowflake as a better example because it's in the same space as MemSQL. So Snowflake, because anybody can light up a Snowflake instance and start sending data to it and using it in their organization, has this massive inbound funnel of users. And so differentiating between the ones that are students just goofing around with Snowflake versus a developer that works at like Lockheed Martin is a really important thing. And also their ASPs are much lower than MemSQL. So if you have an inside sales team in San Mateo of like 15 mid-market salespeople, each of whom are managing concurrently 50 or 100 deals, being more CRM excellent and making sure that the reps are on top of their deals and not losing track of things becomes way more important. So it's really contingent on the sales motion. So if you do have, so let's use Xamarin as an example. So Xamarin, bought by Microsoft, what would we call them? I guess they're like a mobile development framework. Massive inbound funnel that was focused on, where they didn't really have an outbound motion at all. They just had this like fire hose of inbound. They had a really gnarly sales operations function that was focused on like facilitating that inbound funnel, differentiating between the crap and people who were potentially legit, getting them access to the materials that they needed in order to have success, and then instrumenting their utilization in order to understand, okay, cool, in addition to this individual right here being highly successful with our product, also they happen to work for an organization that has 1,000 developers in that organization. Cool, we should attack that proactively. So they had a really heavy investment in sales operations because it was very important for their go-to-market, as distinct from a MemSQL, or trying to think of another, like maybe like a Rainforest QA where the ASPs are higher. So it really depends. And so just being mindful of like what's the velocity, what's the complexity of your sales motion that might pull forward the point at which you want to have more sales operations investment, as opposed to just like running it out of a spreadsheet or out of your brain, because you're only managing 15 deals, each of which could be worth like $250,000.
So helping companies make the transition. So you have like a really good funnel, you have good leads, you're able to kind of transition those to leads, and so you're getting kind of the push to move up market. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about the consideration of taking larger customers that might require different product features or require an entirely different selling motion, and thinking about like that, having that calculus for founders?
Yeah, so there's very much like a Goldilocks scenario where on the one hand, you don't want to pretend, you don't want to tell yourself a story that you just publish documents or you publish your product and people are going to buy it and that's going to be enough to build your business. We kind of already crapped on that idea earlier in this conversation. At the same time, like closing really, really large enterprise deals can be dangerous for early stage organizations for a number of reasons. Like one, they have outsized expectations for the delivery of product to them, not from like an SLA and uptime standpoint, but they're just very needy from an integration standpoint. Moreover, they like if like 30% of your revenue is one customer, are you a product company or are you kind of a professional services company for this one customer? And so if they know that and they can say, hey, actually we want this feature over here that isn't aligned with your roadmap, and by roadmap I mean the things that is going to create value for the thousands of other customers that you eventually want to sell to, that you just have to be careful of being pulled in that direction. I know this is a little bit of like this is the product management thing I'm talking about right now, but you put yourself in that situation of having to make those product management trade-offs if you're going and prematurely selling to the enterprise. So early on, I feel that for most organizations, selling to the mid-market is probably the right solution. Now, there are exceptions to this. Like there's a Greylock company called Blend that sells mortgage application processing automation software. Super sexy. But I think the 5 or 6 biggest mortgage processing organizations in the United States do something like 30 or 40% of the market. And so going and selling to them and building the product for them enabled them to have a solution that would handle the like long tail mid-market. So there definitely are exceptions there, but prematurely going up market, because a lot of times what ends up happening is VCs will push on an organization to say, hey, I want to see your ASPs go up, right? Or sorry, I want to see your revenue go up. And a way, there's 2 ways you can make revenue go up. You can sell more deals or you can sell bigger deals. And if you're not sales process excellent, then an easier way, potentially an easier way of ramping your revenue is to just try to sell bigger and bigger and bigger deals, as opposed to selling more deals by scaling out the number of salespeople that you have. That right there, scaling out the number of salespeople you have, again, use the server metaphor, just stamping out more job boxes, if you will, and then putting the software on that such that you can sell more, is usually the more repeatable, like safer, lower risk, repeatable approach. And so in general, I recommend that people be skeptical of going up market until you actually have that mid-market motion going very well. At which point, when you move into the enterprise, you recognize that it actually is a different segment of buyer who will have different product requirements and different like purchasing requirements and what have you, and almost kind of treat it as a new vertical, as opposed to thinking like, oh, the same way that I sold to SMB or mid-market is totally going to work here. Yeah, so that's like my disposition on enterprise, premature enterprise selling, or the metaphor I like to use is like there's rabbits, there's deers, and there's elephants. Rabbits are kind of fast. If you end up killing one, there's like not really all that much to make a meal. Deer is kind of nice because you take one down, you can eat for a few days on it. Elephant, if you actually take it down, it might fall on you and kill you. And then moreover, if you do take it down, now you got to eat the goddamn thing, and like it's so huge, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, so some of the things that we sitting through the partner meetings, that some of the like mid-sized companies are not that much harder to close than the enterprise customers, and so you see that like there's a lot of like effort that goes into like understanding what makes a good customer, and like the amount of effort it takes to close it, like figuring out if the juice is worth the squeeze for like that particular customer. Because if you're going to have an intensive sales motion, you have to make sure it's kind of worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean that's a counter argument to my argument, which is like, hey, I was complaining to Dan earlier that I sold a $40,000 deal recently, and it took like 10 or 15 meetings, and we were like, wah, that's like so much work to close a $40,000 deal. But I think the point remains, which is, if you're gonna have a sales process that takes 10 meetings to close, would you like $40,000 out of that, or would you like $200,000 out of it? Now the question, of course, is like, do you have the product that can service the $200,000 organization? As with most of these questions, it depends, right? I think first and foremost, so the question was, how do you approach the sales hire? Do you target somebody who's more junior? Do you takes less capital? Do you target somebody who's more senior, can put a program in place, et cetera? So the model, the design pattern that I like is assuming that the founder has he or she has sold a sufficient amount of deals to start out with. I prefer to prove that you can bring on a more junior person who to replicate that, right? To prove out that this can be executed on another human that is not the founder. And the reason why I like that design pattern, and this again depends, if you're selling if you're selling $500,000 ASP deals where the only way you can get in the door is if you have an amazing suit and like you've sold to the person that the buyer is previously, then this recommendation is stupid. But if you're like most of the organizations, like most SaaS organizations that's selling into the mid-market with a new, new disruptive product, then usually this pattern works. So first of all, there's more of those humans. So once you prove that, the first one, you can get a second one, a third one, a fourth one, et cetera. The other thing too is hiring that more senior person. And by senior person, I don't think you mean a senior sales rep. I think you mean like a VP of sales or what have you. The problem with that person frequently is that they're not a doer. They're a manager. And so what you want right now is somebody who you want another seller. Or there's kind of an intermediary there, and this is a design pattern that I like for a first like sales manager hire, or a first seller / sales manager hire is either a sales manager, high potential sales manager who hasn't been so out of the trenches for so long that he or she can't do a demo, or it's like, oh, I don't want to do 15 meetings a week, that sounds like work, that sort of thing. Like you don't want to have that person. You want to have someone who's like, yeah, like I'm used to being on calls with my reps all the time and being essentially an adjunct seller, or selling, like it hasn't been that long since I've sold myself, but I have the upside optionality to manage people, right? Such that when we actually know that we can clone this out repeatedly, he or she will be able to hire those incremental people and manage those. So I have a tendency to prefer towards the prior pattern, but it really is contingent on if the founder has sold those deals themselves previously and has some sort of capacity to at least hire and onboard that individual. again, David Scott and I were talking about this the other day, that's a hard prescription to make. Like if you have a solo founder who, like I actually don't believe that, so I don't have a background in sales. And so I'm a pretty reasonable sales rep. I'm not a great sales rep. But if I can be a pretty reasonable sales rep, then anybody can be a pretty reasonable sales rep. It has nothing to do with like innate talent or what have you. Like maybe being crazy 10x, like, you know, SRE recruiter or crazy 10x salesperson, which there aren't really that many 10x salespeople. Like that might be innate, but getting to the point where you can just, you know, repeatedly sell yourself is actually not all that terribly hard. It's actually just work and craft. The same way that, you know, learning to code in JavaScript is not like magic, it just takes work. But there are exceptions to it making sense for an organization to have a founder spend his or her time doing that. And that can be in the scenario where it's a solo founder situation where like if the product is gonna start standing still as a result of you starting to sell, that might not be a great idea. Or if you have like two technical co-founders, neither of which can like even imagine the scenario in which they're interfacing with humans on a frequent basis. Like, you know, wild dogs couldn't pull them to do that. Then in that scenario, then you might try to go for that more senior person, but in a very specific profile where you're not hiring that, because like sales leaders and salespeople are not product managers and they're not product marketers. They're there to sell a solution that works, and they're there to do it in parallel. And a sales leader is there to hire people to do that in parallel and onboard them and motivate them and manage them. They're not there to build the sales software necessarily. So in that scenario where you have the solo founder or the founder who just like can't even with the learning how to sell, then in that scenario you're looking for a very, very, very specific like unicorny, purple squirrely type of sales, early evangelical sales leader that is more like a weaponized product manager than actually a salesperson or a sales leader. That is not the common design pattern though. And because that human, essentially what you're doing is you're bringing on almost like a founder after the fact. And so that's very difficult to find.
There's not a lot of them. Like I've been lucky to work with a number of people that like understand, like if you don't know the value of your product or like what do you charge for a particular product, like there's a handful of people out there that fundamentally like understand how to sell value. And so they go to a person, like understand the pain, like they're able to do the math on like how much it actually costs to get them to like solve that pain. Yeah. And they get you right up to the edge of it. And then they figure out a way of doing that repeatedly. The way that I've seen founders kind of handle this is they keep doubling their price with new customers until someone says no, and then they go between like the average between the last sales price. And so like they leave a little bit of money on the table in the beginning, but it gets them to like that price to like figure out like where the value kind of breaks.
That's a totally great design pattern. Yeah. Like we did that at TalentBin.
We'll just keep increasing the price until someone says no.
Keep charging the price. Well, no, keep increasing the price until your win rate gets to like, I don't know, between 20 or 30%. So if like you're winning 100% of your deals, you're probably like not charging enough, right? You want to have some people who are like, no. I apologize for like the sales jargon. So SMB, it depends on the market that you're selling into, but SMB is usually considered organizations below 200 or 500. Again, every organization defines it themselves. Mid-market is between like 500 and a couple thousand, and then enterprises from there on up. Probably a better way to think about it is like how many people have to be involved in the transaction. So don't think of it in terms of the size of the organization, but instead think about it in terms of like how big of a pain in the ass the sales motion is. There's only, so the question was, what are the perils of like raising your average selling price? It's less that like there's nothing wrong with selling more, like selling more of your solution. The thing that can be potentially dangerous is if that requires you to start attacking customers that require a bunch of new functionality that is like very costly from an engineering standpoint. So like I'll give it an example with Atrium. So we make like pretty badass sales analytics software, and we hook into the email, calendar, phone, and CRM systems for a sales organization in order to instrument the level of sales performance that's going on there. So for SMB and mid-market organizations, they're like, that sounds awesome, let's do it, and they light up the data, and it's fantastic. When you get to larger organizations, they're like, whoa, have you heard of the GDPR, right? And we're like, yeah, we've heard of the GDPR, or we've heard, and so what they'll like, so if we were to say, hey, I really want to chase this deal right here, but I have to become GDPR compliant, I have to go through SOC 2, and I have to go through, what is it, ISO 9000 and 90210? I don't know what it is. And I have to take engineering hours and start going after that, as opposed to building more user-facing functionality or actual like value-creating functionality. But instead, I'm building software that is purely for the purpose of selling. Then that might be a bad trade-off. And so if I said like, oh, but I want to sell more I want to sell bigger deals, and so in order to sell bigger deals, I have to get SOC 2 compliance or ISO 9000 compliance or what have you, and I just blindly run after that, as opposed to saying like, well, maybe instead I should have use those engineering hours to build features that are going to lower my sales cycle or raise my win rate or what have you, as opposed to raise my ASP. And I can just attack the world of mid-market organizations, and then eventually I'll get to that. But in the meantime, I have all these these mid-market ducks on the pond. Why would I go after that when I can just like more quickly go after this? Does that make sense? So it's like there's nothing wrong with the higher ASP in general. The question is, what's the trade-offs that you have to do in order to
velocity are you sacrificing to be able to kind of go, like, so you're adding customers at a certain rate at a certain price, and so like if you're going to next segment, like how much velocity are you sacrificing?
Yeah.
And can you grow into those accounts over time? So like the companies that we see that we really like are able to acquire companies or customers pretty quickly, but then have the ability to grow those accounts to a pretty sizable revenue number. And so like you kind of have this like if you have this really beautiful curve of like, okay, well, they're adding X number of logos, and those cohorts have negative churn, and so they keep going up at the same time that you're adding new logos. So you get more of a predictable kind of revenue stream that will grow, and will help you raise a lot of money.
So the way you would test this is you start figuring out what the features are that you run up against, or where there becomes friction in the sales motion. So I don't know if anyone has ever read The Goal. It's like one of my favorite books. It's an operations engineering book written as a love novel. It's fantastic. And like the way to think about your sales organization is just the machine. And so what you should try to sell into those larger organizations, but then when you run into the fact that, oh man, above this size of organization, now they actually have a tools purchasing committee. And so instead of it being 5 meetings to get $40,000, it becomes 15 meetings to get $60,000. Well, in that scenario, that doesn't seem like a great trade-off. I should probably just run more deals that are going to give me $40,000 with 5 meetings, or whatever the number was. And so that's instrumenting that in order to understand how efficient your sales motion is, and then also seeing where the actual close loss reasons are. So when you lose a deal, it's really important to characterize why the prospect didn't buy, and you can implement this in your CRM with validation rules and checklist or a multi-select in order to understand like, oh, okay, cool, they didn't buy because there's of no SOC 2 compliance. And then over time, what you can see is how much revenue you're leaving on the table, or what proportion of your deals that are coming through the pipe you're losing because of SOC 2 compliance, and then how much revenue was lost because of that. And at least you can make an intentional decision. Like, yeah, you know what? That's okay for us to leave that on the table, because there's still plenty of these other mid-market organizations that we're going after. Or you get to the point where like, I don't know, man, like more and more we keep hearing about SOC 2 compliance and the deals are really big, so maybe we should prioritize engineering hours to attack that. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're talking about like, how do we evoke in the customer, or sorry, in the prospect, a comprehension of the pain that they're encountering by not implementing our solution, and then the potential value associated with our solution. Is that right? Okay. So the industry terminology for that is product marketing, and essentially it's like commercial storytelling, right? This is the story of why this product is useful for you, and this is the pain that you're encountering otherwise. Yeah, and I'm trying to think of like, I mean, the right way, or like
so you see some of this with like growth mechanics. So within, like, there's a variety of different ways. Like, so like there's some things that are discounting to say like, if you want to sign a long-term deal, we'll give you like half the price on an annual basis. And there's some things like to pull in revenue where you can do some discounting pieces. There's other things on the growth side that either incent people to sign up in the first day, which is like you give them free storage or free consulting or free consultation, where there's something that encourages them to like start using the product, which then allows you to demonstrate value and then kind of get the renewal. And so in a lot of ways, like there's like the whole concept of like, how do you employ freemium? And so I've worked with a number of companies that have been on the freemium side of like, what's the minimum amount of things like you need to give away in order to get someone to be a committed customer? And so usually it doesn't happen from the sales side. Usually that happens from like growth leaders thinking about like, what are the set of things that you can do to drive a certain customer behavior. So if you understand like, what does a customer journey look like, and what is the point that like that customer is now hooked, and what are the set of things that you need to do in order to kind of get a hooked customer, and that tends to be more on kind of growth, demand gen, marketing than it is traditionally on sales. So I don't know if you feel differently.
No, totally. And because in that case, it's like, hey, here's your pain that you have. Here's this thing that solves that pain. It's low friction. You should install it and start getting value. But in order to understand what that pain is, it's kind of a continuum. So, product management is the elicitation of pain from users in order to understand what's the problem that you're trying to solve here. And then we solve that by putting together the alchemy of software and all sorts of fun stuff in order to build something that solves that pain. So, and then once we've done that, we turn around, and it's kind of like the yin to the yang. We then articulate the stuff that we've built that fits to the problems that they articulated that they have, that we built software in order to solve. And now we're essentially just re-articulating to them, hey, you know how you said that you had that pain over here, that when you hire salespeople, it's really hard to understand whether or not they're ramping appropriately? Well, we built this thing that instruments how well they're ramping, and if you buy it, it's going to allow you to ramp them twice as fast or what have you. So it's kind of a continuum where understanding, like doing a really good job around customer interviews and understanding what the pain points are that you're handling. Again, that I can't recommend enough that Michael Sippy article from First Round Review and the structured customer development interviews associated with it, because it's not just what's your problem, but it's also how big is the problem and how much would you pay to resolve this. Because once you start, this is the thing that Dan was talking about earlier, where good salespeople and really what they're engaging in is kind of product marketing, is understanding the magnitude of commercial pain that somebody has. Because if, like, use again LaunchDarkly as an example, if you have outages every so often because like a bug goes onto production that like fucks things up, and you're an e-commerce company, well, that's a pretty sizable magnitude of pain. So understanding that and saying, okay, well, cool. Well, you should buy LaunchDarkly. It only costs $100,000, but you have this many outages that cost you $5 million in like lost revenue a year. You're an idiot not to buy. And they're like, you're right. I'm an idiot not to buy. Here, Edith, here's $100,000. Like that descends from understanding what the problem is, the magnitude of the pain associated with that, and then being able to articulate. And then that gets packaged into like promotions like, hey, e-commerce providers, do you have outages? It sucks, right? and then you turn it into a Google spreadsheet, which you plug in. You say like, hey, how many outages do you have? How much revenue do you lose for each outage? And then of course on the back end, you're capturing that. That's a ROI calculator, which is essentially just a lead generation tool. And then you ship some sort of like lightweight outage preventer that is only a very small portion of the value of having full feature flagging or what have you, but now is a lead generation mechanism that drives inbound for your 100K ASPs.
Consumer companies have been good at this for for extended period of time. So if you can get someone to engage in these 3 behaviors in this amount of time, that person then becomes an active user. And so in the early, even back in the MySpace days, if they invited 3 friends within this period of time, they were going to come back, or if this interaction happened. And so in a lot of the enterprise companies that have a consumer adoption model, there is a similar set of behaviors and activities that if you kind of figure out that map, then you can then try and engage your activities to drive that, get someone to do those behaviors in the specified amount of time, and then it becomes very repeatable.
Yeah, really great examples of that are Slack. Slack is the pinnacle of the inbound freemium sales motion, where they haven't had an allergy to actually selling as well. So they just have this amazing, Slack is a virus within organizations, right? Somebody who has administrative access to a laptop installs it and invites a bunch of other people, and then it starts spreading out, at which point the salespeople are like, oh, got another one. And then they hop on that. So that model can be very powerful if you understand those pieces, but then also understand that you actually at a certain point have to get involved. So there's forgive me for using a sales example or sales tooling example here. There's a company called, anyone familiar with Yesware? It's a sales email software company that had a really great freemium adoption model, but they never got to the mid-market and enterprise features. They never built the features for sales ops or for VPs of sales and what have you. So they have a huge install base of onesie twosies all over the place. But then there's 2 subsequent companies. One is called Outreach, another one is called SalesLoft, that have come in after the fact and really eaten their lunch by virtue of the fact that Yesware thought that was their business, as opposed to it actually being a lead generation mechanism. The question was around customer success, when you hire for that, et cetera. So the design pattern that I like there is 1, build the product, understand that the problem exists, build and validate that. That's customer development. Build the product that then fits that problem, and then validate that people actually get value out of it. There's a lot of organizations that can sell a solution where the customer doesn't necessarily get value out of it, they don't use it. The KPIs that you want to move don't move, even though they bought the software. So having a focus on customer success early on is important, even if you're still in a founder-led selling context. So that's the first and foremost, is customer success is actually very important, because people have to get value out of your stuff, or else they won't renew, and then that's really bad. So then the question becomes, cool, whose job is that? Is it the salesperson? Is it the founder's job? Is it the salesperson's job, or what have you? And I think in that scenario, so I'll use Atrium as an example right now. I'm the only salesperson at Atrium. We're still in a founder-led selling motion right now, and I have 2 CS people. And I have 2 CS people. This is where I go like this. I have 2 CS people because we have so many customers that I've closed that if I were trying to service them, it would be a problem for me. That's not necessarily a common case. In my case, because I'm very well networked in the sales operations, sales leadership community, it's pretty easy for me to get meetings with prospects and eventually sell them the software. So that's not necessarily but in my case, because we have so many customers right now, it would overwhelm me in order to spend my time on that. So we hired more CS before we hired more salespeople. But you can imagine a scenario where it would only make sense to abstract CS off into its own function or its own human until we got to the point where we had 3 salespeople throwing off a lot of customers. It really kind of depends, but the way to think about it is, what are the tasks that are being done and what's the opportunity cost of those tasks being done by the founder or the salesperson or what have you. And then when it gets to the point where, okay, we're spending so much time doing support, or alternatively, we're not doing an intentional job of implementing our customers, and so we have dead on arrival deals where we sell them a deal and they're not implemented 3 months later. That would be an indicator that you're not spending enough time on customer success, and you want to instrument that proactively such that you don't want to know that dead on arrival deal was dead on arrival 12 months later when they don't renew. You want to know it up front by understanding that they have no utilization and they're not getting value out of your solution. So having that instrumented and then seeing what the opportunity cost is of the people who are doing that as compared to what else they could potentially be doing, like closing more business, is really the way that you're going to know the answer to that question. So unfortunately, there's not a really easy prescription there, but instead that's more like a framework to help you, make the decision on your own.
Yeah, I think the velocity of the customers that you're closing will dictate how big of a customer success organization you have, and then and then you don't want it to kind of scale infinitely. You actually want to figure out your engineering team actually to help in some of the customer success pieces as well, because that'll allow you to kind of automate or solve the technical issues that are causing things to not renew or to block people from kind of moving in. So the shortcut is put engineers on the customer success team to solve those issues, and those product issues get solved real fast.
It sounds like a VP of engineering would kick your ass for advocating that. Yeah, I mean, another way, so we're kind of talking about product management right now as related to customer success and go-to-market, but a really helpful way of doing product management, or at least enterprise product management, is to correlate the features to the KPI that they're going to impact. So in my case, because I'm a glorified sales rep, the KPIs I care about is deal cycle. So how many meetings it takes me to close a deal. Win rate. So how stoked are people and how blown is their mind on the software, because they're gonna have a propensity to buy more. So the win rate, my batting average is gonna be better. And then ASP, larger organizations that I can sell into. There's another KPI which is essentially just cost of delivery. So how many customers a customer success person can carry. So right now we have a really hands-on customer success motion. All my customer success people are sales operations folks, because we're kind of we're sales operations software as a service a little bit. And so we have sales ops people being our CS function as a way to overclock our CS function. But right now they can only handle whatever it is, 30 customers or 40 customers each, which is not a scalable model, because if you have a customer success person that costs $80,000 in San Francisco and they can only handle 40 people, 40 customers, that's 2 Gs of customer success human per customer. That's not super scalable. So eventually we will build features that reduce that cost by virtue of the actions of the customer success people do will ideally be automated and what have you. A very standard sales compensation structure for account executives is a 50-50 base on target. On target means the total compensation. So imagine that you have a sales rep, so 50-50 base on target, where the total compensation of that rep is around 20% of the total amount of money that they bring in. So to make this more concrete, say that you have a mid-market sales rep. There's a little bit of a circularity here where the cost of your salesperson should be correlated to how much can be sold at what velocity of your solution. So so to use an example, say you have a $150,000 mid-market sales rep. So they're making $150,000 a year. their base salary would be $75,000. Their variable would be $75,000. And then that variable, generally speaking, is going to be 10% of whatever revenue they bring in. So they would have a quota of $750,000. And so that would be like a healthy compensation scenario. If you have somebody, a lot of this is based on like the cost of living in a given environment. So imagine that you have software that you sell into SMB businesses. So like say you're Groupon or say you're Thanks or 5 Stars, and you're selling loyalty software to 7-Elevens and bars and what have you. And the ASP on those deals are $1,000. And it takes at least one call or maybe 2 meetings in order to close that $1,000 deal. Well, the reality is like that person's probably gonna, just because there's only 24 hours in a day and 8 hours in a workday, it's probably gonna be pretty tough for them to do more than $300,000 a year in bookings. So you probably can't staff that person in San Francisco, right? Because in order to make our unit economics good, we probably wouldn't want to pay that person who's doing $300,000 a year in bookings. We probably wouldn't want to pay them more than $60,000 a year. And if we had to pay like $100,000 in order to get $300,000 in bookings, well now like we look like a shitty investment, because in order to scale up our revenue numbers, we're gonna have to hire tons and tons and tons of salespeople at like not great margins. So instead, maybe it makes sense for that sales organization to be in Salt Lake City or Denver or fill in the blank. So, but generally speaking, like the rule of thumb is a 50-50 base on target, where you want your cost of sales to be lower than 25 or 30% of like the total cost of acquiring that revenue.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is like most of the comp survey data is pretty good for engineers or other people that aren't in sales. Part of it is it's a little bit more challenging to figure that out. So like, who do we sell to? What kind of sales reps do we need? What is their opportunity cost for them going to work at our company? So if we're looking to hire these kind of people, and they're like, okay, well, their OTE is $300K, and they make unless our renewals are really high, it doesn't make sense to actually have customers like that.
Yeah.
And you don't pay them on the renewal. So you'll probably move it back and forth a little bit. And so you'll figure out like there's the thing that you want and the thing you can afford.
Yeah.
And then it'll just take a while like playing with different types of people at different levels in companies to figure that out.
And sometimes what Dan points to right there is sometimes your pricing has to be predicated on like what your sales motion is. So like software, the marginal value the marginal cost of your software is free. So, which is kind of funny. So when MemSQL charges whatever the hell it is that they charge for their stuff, or Instabase charges whatever the hell it is for their stuff, a lot of the time it's predicated on how hard it is to sell into the organization. So if you have to hire super slick Oracle sales reps, or you're having to hire people out of Cloudera or out of AppD, and they're making $400K a year, like that's their opportunity cost, as Dan says. So then we have to say, okay, cool. In order to pay a sales rep a $400K OTE, in order to pull them out of AppD, how many deals do they have to sell of? Actually, a good example would be OverOps, I suppose. They're a heavy bit network company that does like kind of APM 2.0. In order to pull those folks out of there, how many deals can they sell? How many meetings does it take in order for them to do that? Okay, seems like they could probably, and then what's the win rate? All right, it seems like they could maybe sell 25 deals a year. Cool, well, I guess our pricing has to be this in order for 25 deals to line up to whatever that would be, like $2.5 million. So there is a little bit, sometimes your pricing isn't based on like the cost. Again, I was joking about the fact that like, the marginal cost of software is largely free, it sometimes is based on the cost of distribution.
There's the Ashin Chanda at Greylock is probably one of the most successful enterprise investors of like all time. The guy's been investing for 15 years, has lost money once, like it's unheard of. So in the beginning, he's like 100% about product. But then after, he's all sales productivity. So he's like, all right, like I know the product is good. Open up the spreadsheet, show me every rep, where are they at with regards to quota, how long does it take them to ramp? And then once that's predictable, he's like, you hire as many reps as you can. Mm-hmm. Because like that's how revenue growth happens. And so he's like, that's why his companies like are consistently like hit their revenue targets, and why he doesn't lose money.
Probably a thing that could be helpful for a lot of your folks is the book I wrote on sales for founders. Just ping me. I'll flip you the friends and family copy. It's a bunch of inner hyperlinked Google documents. But I swear the content's good, even though it doesn't have like a slick cover on it. But like those are the things that I think could be helpful to folks as follow up on this.
Thank you very much.